Welcome back to my channel. Let's back into our book, The Trilateral Commission, one of the subsets of the Illuminati. And they real active to this day. Most of its members are part of this government, Senate, President, House of Representatives, Congressman, head of industry. Oh my goodness, this is tangled. Head of industry. And we get, this book was written in 1980 and it's still relevant today to 1985. Okay. It was not long before these It was not long before these transnational financial powers began to act in a series of articles, conferences, and exchanges of opinion in most important economic, political, and theatrical representatives of transnational capital. Brzezinski, he is who helped groom Obama, along with Henry Kissinger and George Soros. David Rockefeller, Illuminati, George Ball, C.F. Bernstein, Richard Cooper, Richard Gardner, David Packard, Cyrus Vance, W. Michael Blumenthal, Sir Alec Cairncross, Don Corleone, Don Corleone? Is that the mafia? Raymond Barr, Jean Ray, John Loudon, Sinduro Figino, Saburo Okita. See who's who on the Trilateral Commission. It was generally agreed that the wounds caused by Nixon's shots were not going to heal themselves, and that transnational interests had to be more vigorously championed internationally. It was impossible, of course, for international economic system to return to the status quo or the scene of the crime, given the change and changing scene. Nixon's economic policy, an increasingly unsettled scene in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and the emergence of OPEC and the oil crisis of 73-74, all these factors had complemented and irreparably changed the capitalist world. But the international financial and corporate interests meant to see that these changes were dealt with so as not to threaten their transnational economic interests. In early 73, Rockefeller and Brzezinski launched the Trilateral Commission. Here we go. See, creating the Trilateral Commission. Okay. Is the Trilateral Commission a conspiracy? Yes. But they're saying in this book, no. More than the laws of capitalism conspire to assert themselves. The Trilateral Commission is the executive advisory committee to the transnational finance capital. As Richard Falk had pointed out, the vistas of the Trilateral Commission can be understood as the ideological perspective representing the transnational outlook of the multinational corporations, which seeks to subordinate territorial politics to non-territorial economic goals. Before we move on to examine the Trilateral Commission's ideas, it might be in order to recall the political events of recent years. The most striking event of the past decade was, of course, the Watergate affair and the scuttling of the entire administration. It is beyond the scope of this article to examine the direct relationship of transnational capital to Watergate. Suffice it to say that involved or not in Nixon's demise, the international financiers sighed with relief when Richard Nixon made his stumbling, feverish exit. The Ford administration was much more reasonable, if somewhat non-committal, and on August 19, 1974, appointment of Nelson Rockefeller as Ford's vice president spelled the final and definitive end to the turbulent Nixon shock years and the threat of a new protectionism. Vice President Rockefeller became presumably closer to his brother David than to the ex-congressman from Grand Rapids. One can sense the cautious relief and guarded optimism in David Rockefeller's remarks to the Chamber of Commerce of the European Community in 1975. So they got rid of Nixon, created the Watergate scandal. David Rockefeller, Illuminati itself, becomes VP. Wow, under Ford. Wow, this go deep. Excuse me. Oh, excuse me. Oh, this go deep. I share your concern over the number of petitions which have already been filed under the anti-dumping and countervailing duty provisions of the 1974 Trade Act. I am equally distressed, both as a free trader and as an executive in an industry as vulnerable to reciprocity as banking, by the large number of bills in Congress that will inhibit the flow of foreign investments into this country. Most are outright protectionism and should be killed in the committee. So you know they really pissed at Trump, right? Fortunately, there are no signs that these anti-trade measures are supported by the administration. Furthermore, the White House decision, after some hesitation to participate in the economic summit in Paris, is a further substantiation of the administration's attitude on trade. But it was widely felt that the Republican Party was dead, and especially with the possible convention victory of Ronald Reagan, who stood for everything the transnational imperialists had worked to eliminate. There were more than a few hints that the commission had a hand in the strange rise to power of Jimmy Carter. There you go. Interdependence is nothing new, but its present scale certainly is. Phenomena indicative of interactions across national frontiers have grown during the past generation even faster than the output as a whole. Trade began the major economies, for instance, had increased about 8% annually against an average annual growth of the global economy of about 5%. International production by integrated multinational companies had risen faster, about 10%. A fifth of the industrial output of the market economy countries is now controlled by corporations which plan their investment, their fiscal transactions, their use of production capacity, their sales policy on a transnational basis. This excerpt from the first report of Trilateral Political Task Force of 1973 confirms the underlying reality of the Trilateral Commission's policy statements and programmatic declarations. The overriding goal is to make the world safe for interdependence by protecting the benefits which it provides for each country against external and internal threats which will constantly emerge from those willing to pay the price for more national autonomy. This may sometimes require slowing the pace at which interdependence proceeds and checking some aspects of it. More frequently, however, it will call for checking the intrusion of national governments into the international exchange of both economic and non-economic goods. First on the list is precious metals. It's foreign direct investment. The expansion of foreign investments has brought with it some unwanted side effects. Host countries, especially the neo-colonies, have increasingly disturbed a tendency to nationalize foreign businesses or at least to tax them at something approaching reasonable rates. For obvious reasons, one of the Commission's imperatives is a safe atmosphere for foreign investment. Docile neo-colonial governments willing to enforce the super exploitation of their workforce. It has its proposed new national rules to check the efforts of national governments to seize for their own countries a disproportionate share of benefits by foreign direct investment. Linked with this is Trilateral Commission's ideas on trade policy, which can be summarized in a single familiar word: libertarianization. Here we go. A progressive, across-the-board automatic reduction and elimination of tariffs on industrial products. Oh, they pissed at Trump. Oh, they mad at Trump. The elimination of tariffs. Wow. Similar, if less than drastic measures are recommended for non-tariff barriers to trade, import and export controls, confusing custom procedures, subsidiaries. We leaving in 15 minutes. You must not be going. Buy American campaigns and the like. The reasons are clear and consistent. Success has been slow to date, and the many protectionism pressures now being exerted on the government by U.S. steel corporations, shoe manufacturers, and others highlight the political difficulties faced by transnational free traders. International monetary reform was another priority on the transnational agenda, primarily because the system was in such disarray, and this confusion was contributing to the strengthening of the neo-nationalist forces. In 1973, coherent international monetary reform, or lack of, was the monkey wrench in the transnational machine. Instead, the first task force report was on the topic. Although monetary policy continues to be important, it's no longer a paramount concern, as many of the Commission's recommendations, flexible exchange rates, the elimination of gold as a monetary vehicle within the International Monetary Fund, you can make this up, increased use of IMF special drawing rights, improvements in the use of short-term credit to offset balance of payments deficits have been adopted. Perhaps the most interesting development in the Commission's plans has been its attempts to get a grip on turbulence in the Third World. An example was the tremendous problems posed by petrodollars by the OPEC countries, such as the accumulation of unused capital in OPEC coffers were serious, and much effort went into plans to recycle this capital toward the profit-making machinery of the transnational corporations. One early plan was the third window, whereby OPEC countries would, through the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, all controlled, owned by the Rothschilds, Illuminati, through the World Bank, and with subsidies from the advanced capitalist countries, lent large sums of money to other third world countries to allow them to buy more goods produced by transnational corporations and to keep them in debt, impoverished, and keep them under control. That is a fact. A joint trilateral OPEC initiative that brings forth more capital for development would serve some very immediate trilateral country interests. In a time of stagnant growth and rising unemployment, it is obviously advantageous to move funds from OPEC countries, which cannot spend them on trilateral country exports, to developing countries who will. The history of this particular proposal indicates the powerful influence on the Commission on international politics and economics, first raised in 1974 by the Task Force on political and international implications of the energy crisis, it was fleshed out later in the year and discussed with the World Bank and international monetary officials in September of that year. In January 1975, the World Bank called for further study of the Third Window Plan. In February, the final task force report was published. In July 1975, the World Bank accepted the proposal, which is now functioning to this day, 2025. Wow. International commercial banks have also played a major role in recycling money from OPEC treasure chests toward the fertile financial soil of countries like Brazil and Mexico. But it quickly became clear that no financial sleight of hand would be significant to completely solve the energy problem, and according the task force called for long-range program for the Trilateral countries to reduce dependence on OPEC petroleum. More generally, since the energy crisis, the Trilateral Commission's work has shifted its focus on the problems of continuing imperialist domination of neo-colonies have become more glaring. Thus, more recent Trilateral reports have emphasized the need to integrate the so-called developing world into international capitalism. This integration takes many forms, from allowing the neo-colonies a symbolical greater voice in organizations like the IMF to trying neo-colonial economies even closer to the Western finance. Two well-known examples of this is more relaxed African policy of the Carter administrations on one hand, and the astronomical debt of many underdeveloped countries on the other hand. Wow. Both with different degrees of insidiousness serve to encourage or to force third world countries to act within the economic, political limits prescribed by the major industrial powers. Keep them in debt, they under your control. The Commission's proposals on these and other issues are complex and comprehensive. Many are discussed elsewhere in this volume. Here it is enough to summarize one more, their general game plan. A capitalist world dominated by the industrial capitalist nations themselves cooperating in a concerted offensive against third world revolutionary by pursuing the irredeemable integration of neo-colonies into international capitalist commodity investment and financial markets, and cooperating in presenting a common front to the socialist world of economic, political, and military matters. The Trilateral Commission is not a cabal or conspiracy. That is a lie, because it is. As some would have it, it is the international forum for discussion and decision-making of imperialist finance in an unsubtle age, with ties to every major imperialist government, every transnational bank and corporation, and every major imperialist think tank. Its power is significant. A concerted power based on a commonality of interests and concerns rather than a blood oath. Wow. Rather than a blood oath. Why would you write that? If it wasn't true, why would you write that? Ain't nowhere in this book they ever talked about blood oaths. Wow. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment.